How's everybody doing? Okay, first of all, I wanted to really just take an opportunity to kind of present a little bit of what's going on in venture. I mean, there's been a lot of guys in venture up here and entrepreneurs in here, and the audience is predominantly people that are starting companies, and I think one of the things I really wanted to do is give some perspective on different approaches to venture. So, I mean, the way I wanted to kind of open it up was just have each of you kind of take a second to describe how you guys look at it, what you're doing, and then we can kind of dive into the conversation a bit.
Sure. Well, Y Combinator funds startups typically at the earliest stage. We have an application form. We even have a no idea track where people apply before they've even figured out what idea they want to work on. We interview them, we bring them in. We have a sort of a 3-month structured program where they have weekly dinners and office hours with us. They present at Demo Day at the end. I guess what makes YC unique is the scale. We do a small amount of money in every deal, between 17 to 20,000, but each batch has been growing. So this previous batch was 84 companies. The batch before it was 66. So we've done over 140 companies this year.
And John, that actually contrasts fairly substantially with your model.
Yeah, we're very different. We're very different from that, and we're not venture. So I hope I'm on the right panel. So BetaWorks is a company, right? We're operators. We build stuff, and we build 3 or 4 companies per year, and then as a secondary activity, we do seed investing. And when we seed invest, we look like an angel investor. So 150,000 average investment size. We've invested in several Y Combinator companies over the years, but we act as an angel investor. And our investment activities sort of helps, both of the activities feed one another. But we had very much a thesis when we started BetaWorks that we didn't want to be a venture fund, because I think that in the world that we're entering, there's a need for new models. And I think that the venture model has a tremendous amount of value and scale to it, but I think it's strained when it comes to a few different areas, which are becoming, in my mind, more important. So our model's different. We're an operating company, of course, a holding company. I sometimes refer to it as a studio, but we build stuff and then we seed invest.
Now, you still look for traditional venture later stage, or you don't actually expect to have traditional Sequoia-type companies invest in the companies that you
So the companies that we've built to date, I mean, Bitly, Chartbeat, and SocialFlow have all taken outside investors from mainstream VCs. And so they have sort of moved out of the studio and are standing on their own as independent companies with VC investors.
Okay. And Harj, in your case, all of your companies are going to be seeking outside investment beyond the initial sort of starter capital that you provide.
That's essentially the purpose of Demo Day, is to get them funded by a later stage investor.
So there's been some interesting controversy. Kevin Rose was on stage earlier and was asked about the now, I'm sure, infamous memo about Google Ventures and Y Combinator. I also understand there's kind of some interesting internal tools that let YC founders communicate with each other about the quality and sort of behavior of certain investors. So I'm sure a lot of people that are contemplating taking money from these guys are interested in the inside knowledge.
Well, yeah, one thing that YC, I guess, sort of stumbled into, it wasn't intentional, or at least when Paul started originally, is the power of the alumni network. And actually, if you ask a lot of people why they do Y Combinator, or what was a big draw, it was the power of the alumni network, and in particular, the knowledge that's contained within it, around multiple areas. And we've been doing things to try and spread the flow of that knowledge. We started organizing YC-only conferences, and we get YC founders who are experts on particular fields, whether it's like SEO or iPhone app distribution, to come in and talk off the record to other YC startups about it. And what you mentioned there is another instance of, we realize there's a huge amount of information about dealing with investors and working with investors contained in sort of the heads of all of the YC founders. So we built some software that just tracks that. Like, people can track who they raise investment from, If they have any comments, they can leave that. And it doesn't create like a necessarily sort of like a rank ordered list, but it's more just sort of information. So if anyone's speaking to a particular investor, they can just go in and see, all right, like maybe I should speak to X from this YC company because they raised money from him a year ago.
So I'm just kind of curious, I mean, you said there's not necessarily a forced ranking, but I'm assuming that there are preferences. So what would you say are the top 5 venture funds that are of interest to YC companies?
I don't think anyone would be massively surprised by that list. It's it would be the names that everyone knows, right? It's mostly driven by when founders are thinking about which VCs to raise money from. I think it's a lot driven by the companies that they've invested in the past. So, I mean, Sequoia have an incredible track record of Google, even going back further, Cisco, Apple. If you look at recently, Andreessen Horowitz has been investing in a bunch of super high-profile deals, and then I don't know, you have like Excel invested in Facebook, and a whole tail of them. But essentially, the ones like the
so
one
that was 3. You need 2
that was
more.
3. All the ones I'm going to say.
Those are the only 3.
Google Ventures.
Google Ventures.
Google Ventures. And John, from your standpoint, I mean, when you look for money coming in later stage, do you have a preference as to which investors are?
You know, we've worked with a lot of investors, and I think that if you want a simple rule of thumb, and like all rules of thumb, it's mostly useful, but sometimes on the edge doesn't apply. But a simple rule of thumb for me is that investors who are makers, who are operators, who are builders, I think understand what it takes, not surprisingly, to build a company much better than people who are not. And so, there are certain firms that pride themselves as being predominantly maker, sort of user VCs, and I think that those people, so, on this coast, I mean, clearly Greylock, obviously Y Combinator, which is a group of operators, makers. There's, Andreessen Horowitz, clearly operators. SV Angel as a seed stage group, they're a group of makers and people who are deep as user VCs. So, how many did I get? I got 4. I mean, I think that there's, if you want, that's the rule of thumb I would use, is the person you're working with there, because at some level, forget the firm, is the person you're working with there got experience in actually building companies.
So talking about the evolution of venture, which is sort of what this panel is about, it does seem like there's been a pretty predominant shift towards, you call them user VCs or maker VCs or operators. Yesterday I heard Bill Campbell make the comment about Ben Horowitz that he was one of the best operators in the Valley, and now he's gone to the dark side to become a venture guy, but clearly still bringing that perspective as an operator. Do you think there's a place for sort of a non-operating person in this game anymore? I mean, we were chatting a little bit about kind of an East Coast perspective versus a West Coast perspective, which is on the East Coast a bit more towards almost like private equity stock pickers still, as opposed to these people, people that have real perspective on starting and building companies.
Right. I mean, look, we've all got we all run our businesses in the way that we see appropriate. So I don't want to judge generally, but I mean, I think that I would find it very hard if I was if I didn't have experience, if I wasn't somebody who built companies, who built products, and who thought about products and technology first. I don't even know how to navigate this world if I didn't think that way. So it's clearly it's our bias, and I think that more and more in at least the software business, I think that the closer you can get to the experience of actually making things, the better sense you're going to have of companies and founders and technology.
And Harsh, in the case of YC, all of the partners in YC are former operators as well.
Yeah,
correct.
It would be hard, at least at the end of the spectrum that we operate in, the very first few months of the life cycle of a company. It'd be hard it'd be hard to work at YC or advise the startups without having gone through those few months yourself, because without starting a company, you obviously learn a lot of operational skills, but they don't directly translate into the first 6 months of a company, right? Like, there's not a huge amount of management, for example, that you're going to learn that will be useful for the first 6 months when it's just you and your co-founder and maybe a couple of other people. So, yeah, it would be very difficult to know. And startups themselves are just generally so counterintuitive, unlike anything else you encounter in most of the world. It would just be hard to advise someone without having gone through that process yourself.
So, one of the things as we were kind of chatting a bit prior as well, is just the observation that it seems like there are firms, whether you call them incubators or operating entities, that start companies. And this is sort of a little bit of my background as well. It's very hands-on, very focused on product and market. And then, YC seemingly becoming much more about volume and trying to figure out how to scale. What do you think? Is that part of a continuum? Is it sort of a barbell where you're either building? I was thinking of a term. Is it like a portfolio approach, or in your case, Harsh, where it's a large number of companies and trying to get larger? And John, your sort of very handcrafted model. Do you see that as a continuum? Do you just see them as completely different?
It seems so different. It seems like there should be. It seems like there's completely different models, and I don't feel like either model competes with each other, because they just offer different things, right? Like, if you're looking, like you said, if you're looking to jump in a team and get lots of hands-on operational support, you wouldn't come to YC. We're as hands-on or hands-off as you want us to be, but we don't say, here's the idea that we're excited about, we should build it together and input in that way. We're more sort of here are some things you may think about, here are some options, here are things we've seen work well in the past, but we don't sort of go beyond that. So it depends on what you want. They seem like two completely different things.
John, from your perspective, when you think about trying to recruit, it really becomes a question of recruiting talent, it sounds like, to a certain extent, right? Harsh, you're trying to find people that want to start companies and are ready to start companies, and trying to convince them to do that through YC. Do you find yourself, John, competing with that desire to start new companies outside of the ones that you're creating? How do you guys, is it really about competition for talent, or is it about something else?
I think that there is tremendous amount of competition for talent, but I agree with Harsh. I think that the models is a spectrum, and they just do different things, right? We're an operating company, and we do a couple of things a year, and we're not trying to scale to, I believe, when you started YC, it was first class was 8, and then 16, and then 32, and then you slowed down on the doubling, because that gets scary.
Yeah, it does get scary.
And so now you're at 140 or something? You said
84 in the last batch, just over 140 in total this year.
140 this year, right? So I was going on an annual basis. So if you click through those numbers, you can see that it's a very different model. Now, some of the startup VC programs, like Techstars, for example, in New York, has very intentionally decided to stay small. I believe that they, at least when it was being run by David Tisch, it was about 10 to 12 companies a year, fairly consistently. So I think that they're just different models. At some level, yes, you are competing for talent and resources, but I just think they're different models. And they have different advantages. I think that our model and what we do at BetaWorks is very much, one of the sort of, I mentioned at the outset, some sort of design tension or some tension in the VC model. So I think that we are building now companies, for the first time in history, we're building companies on a single platform. And so that is a huge shift in the way you think about everything from the construction of the companies to the data that they produce. And so the fact that the VC model doesn't actually promote sort of edge connections, what some people refer to as conflicts of interest. So the VC model is very much about picking. And I believe, and one of the reasons why we set BetaWorks up as a company, is that we want to actually maximize the edge connections. because we're all building on the same platform, so we want a lot of connectivity between the companies. So there's no, for us it was very natural that a TweetDeck would interoperate with a Bitly or would, have Surmise embedded in it. I mean, these are all sort of the connections that we try to draw because we're a single company trying to essentially, I'm trying to create a company that mirrors the platform that we're building on, namely the internet. And if you picked up the internet and looked at it, from upside down, all that you'd see is you'd see the connections and you'd see these clusterings of things that we see as companies. But these things that we call companies are these sort of artifacts that we've placed on top of the data that exists on the internet. And the data, though, wants to be able to move and connect between companies. And I think we should find models that promote that. So that's one of the reasons why we're structured as a company and why we try and do what we do.
Right. Well, it does sound a little bit like what YC's done in some of the stuff I've read recently, where the classes are now large enough where a YC company could look to other YC companies as the first set of customers.
Yeah.
And so it is interesting. I mean, I do understand that you guys have very different models, but I guess the question is, are there certain themes that are now pervading sort of the business of starting companies, right? I mean, you're doing it on kind of a boutique level. YC is trying to assist it on a much larger level, but is it about a community that kind of helps itself or each other? You're doing it again, John, on a micro level. Harsh, I think you guys are doing it on a macro level. I'm also kind of interested in your perspective, because obviously there's your two companies, but there's a lot of choices for a team or a person that's looking to start a company. There are some curriculum-based programs where you can almost go to startup school. There are these classes. I mean, you even call them classes, even though I know they're not academic classes, but groupings, where it's meaningful, even to the point where, there's been some people talking about, do I go to business school or do I go to Y Combinator? And it's kind of an interesting question because, a lot of the things people used to talk about with Harvard and Stanford, like it's the network, it's the people you meet, those kinds of things. In your case, you get to leave with debt in the form of a convertible note, and in certain cases, business school, you leave in the form of debt, as in student loans. I mean, there's an interesting, question there.
That's an interesting. I've heard that analogy before.
So,
at least your debt's capped when you.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I'm kind of, again, so I want to, if you kind of look at the landscape, I'm sort of interested in how you guys, outside of your own specific areas, again, if you think about the audience being someone that's contemplating, applying to YC, maybe looking at an opportunity to work with BetaWorks or, a similar, organization. What would you say are some of the most helpful perspectives you can give as venture evolves to your customer, in effect, which is the team or the person looking to start a company?
The question is, if someone's looking to start a company, what
are their options?
What are the various models?
How do you see it? I mean, again, outside of apply to YC.
So let me take a crack at it. I think it's really important to think through and to understand that your investor has a business model too, and to understand what their business model is, because there are sort of structural biases or design biases that exist in everybody's in the capital that comes into your company, and so you should understand that really well. And so, versus thinking of investors as being a monolithic group, that there's different things that you're going to get from whether it's a Google Ventures or whether it's taking money from a mainstream VC or whether it's taking money from one of the startup schools or going into even some of the in New York we have a thing called General Assembly, which I'm sure you have a few of those here. But basically co-working spaces, and they sometimes take equity or put in money. So each of these guys, everybody has a business model. So figure out what their business model is and understand where the money is coming from, because I think that there are structural biases that everybody has.
When yes, when you're starting out a company, I guess you have to think about. You have to think about what environment do you want to be in to essentially maximize the sort of the productivity, or can get you just to the next step. Like identify what the next step for the company is and what gets you to that the quickest, right? So for example, if your next milestone is you want to get to 10,000 in monthly recurring revenue, and you can figure out a way to do that without raising additional capital, and you're happy to do that, then you should just do that. But if you want an environment where you don't want to have to, you want to like cover your costs, and you want to just focus on building the first version of the product for 3 months, then YCE or something like YCE is good for that, because that's what we try and sort of, our main aim is to create this environment where for 3 months you do nothing other than just focus on building product and talking to users. Like that sentence is the most repeated throughout the 3 months. So I would like, that's the way I would think about it, is like, what is it, like, what is the next like milestone or goal that I'm trying to achieve, and what gets me there in the most efficient way.
So, what kind of further evolutions do you guys foresee kind of across the landscape? I mean, you know, we talked about this sort of operator versus classical investor. I mean, it's been interesting to watch Andreessen Horowitz come on to the tier one VC landscape and really approach it as an operator, you know, building out everything from recruiting infrastructure to an executive briefing center where large companies can kind of get access to, you know, baskets of Andreessen investment, you know, portfolio companies. I mean, you know, very, very much of an operating approach versus, you know, more classical, you know, venture model. I'm just kind of curious if you think those are sort of trends towards more infrastructure, more operational approach, or do you think there'll always be a place kind of for, you know, the more conventional investor model?
I believe that one of the reasons people have a hard time modeling sort of Y Combinator in their heads is because at the heart of it, we're essentially just a seed fund. We have like this fund of other people's money and we're trying to make a return on it. But we do all of this stuff that people don't typically associate with the seed fund. Office hours, weekly dinners, whatever the stuff it is that we do, people just don't associate that usually with funds. But I don't think that's going to be true going out 5 or 6 years. It's going to be more and more competitive to get into the deals that people really want to get into, and you just won't be able to get away with loose commitments about what value or how you help companies. You'll have to provide tangible examples of things that you do, and I think VC firms or any investor will just have to build out more infrastructure to handle that. And you're seeing that, like a lot of the angel funds they're staffing up, they're hiring more people. YC itself is no longer a small company. Like YC itself, I believe, has almost more people working for it now than it had in the entirety of the early few batches. So I think that seems just inevitable that anyone in the investing business will just have to provide more sort of infrastructure in order to get into the companies they want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're going through a period of a lot of change in these models, and I think we're going to see more models and new models emerge over the coming 18, 24, 36 months. I mean, I just think it's continuing to, we're at sort of a liminal point where there's some structural changes that are happening to software and the platforms that we're building on that are in turn driving changes to the way the financing models are. So I would say, number one, let's see a lot more innovation, a lot more, you know, there's a handful of people who are doing, who are building companies like BetaWorks. I mean, you guys started out with Grand Central a long time ago doing something similar, you know, Ev and the Obvious Corp, Science. There's people who are innovating around all these spaces that we're talking about. And I think that's super exciting and very important. But if you want to look for big trends or sort of big themes within that, I think that this services, I hate to call it services layer because it sounds like it's paid for services, but it's not just capital anymore. It's right. About helping people to really understand what it is to build a company and how to grow a company and build a business from it. And I think that is sort of a common theme that you're seeing across both these.
Great. So in the last few seconds, there was a lot of controversy about capped notes, convertible debt. Where do you guys come down on that side? I mean, of the question of convertible versus priced rounds.
On convertible versus price rounds, still the vast majority of financing is coming out of Y Combinator are being done on convertible notes. But it's not because anyone likes debt. It's not because founders particularly want debt, and it's not because investors particularly want to own debt. It's just what's going on is that like convertible notes are just a good instrument for the gathering phase of raising funding. Like it's convenient to be able to like ask someone if they'd like to invest, and when they just say yes, to be able to like sign the deal and get it done, versus with a price round, rounding everyone up and waiting until you have everything lined up and then execute on it. It's just a convenient note. But in terms of like the debt aspect of it, that's just sort of incidental. These things just turned out to be a hack for like getting a funding round done in an efficient way. But I think there's probably somewhere, lawyers have never been incentivized to figure out a way to reduce the cost of doing these like initial seed rounds. I think just the pressure now is kind of like force them to figure out something along those lines. So I believe there'll be people will figure out a way to make equity rounds work mechanically more like convertible notes, and then that will solve the issue of having debt, which is not ideal.
So I think we're kind of out of time, John. So do you think thumbs up, thumbs down on convertible?
We've done convertible notes. I'm not a big fan of them. I hate these, ones with multiple caps, because it just doesn't feel very good to have somebody who, 2 weeks earlier got a different cap to you. I think that, the market's changed. I mean, I think the next speaker you have on here is going to talk probably about some of the changes taking place in the market and is driving some of them. But with the Facebook IPO, I think that the world has changed, and I think that the market that we've been in for about 18 months, where there was a lot of looseness to these deals, is going to change, and I think that we're going to see some equity rounds come back in. And I would just wish that entrepreneurs would understand that that there is value to having a priced round, because you actually know what you're getting and what your investors are getting.
That's
and
one thing
in a lot of uncertainty, in a time of a lot of uncertainty, it's like having no certainty around the value of your company is an added risk.
It's certainly dangerous to confuse a convertible note cap with a valuation on your
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, thanks a lot, guys. Hopefully
Pleasure.
this was valuable to everybody out there.